Welcome to the Philosophy of Religion. What we're going to do here is go over this PowerPoint, what I would do in a class lecture. Prolegomena, the things we need to talk about before we engage in our study. Questions like why bother studying religions? And I think it's important always to do a self-checkup, a snapshot of what we believe right now about any particular issue. Especially God's existence, and the justification or the reasons we have to believe in our beliefs. Also, we want to talk about what hangs on this subject. If God exists, does that change anything in our lives? If God doesn't exist, does it matter for humanity? That type of thing. Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx were two atheists who tried to explain the psychology of belief and tried to explain why humans believed in God, even though there is no God. And then we'll move on, talk about what is the philosophy of religion, some of the topics we're going to cover this semester. We'll do Peter Kreeft, thought experiment, talk about important concepts, and some issues in epistemology, the study of knowledge, focusing on J.P. Moreland and his suggested approach to the existence of God. Okay. Topics in the philosophy of religion we're going to explore this semester. We're going to look at some of the arguments for God's existence. Two of the most popular arguments in the last 30 years have been the Kalam cosmological argument by William Lane Craig, which uses a series of dilemmas to argue that the beginning of the universe was caused by a person, and this is what we call God. This has had a huge impact on people. Not everybody buys this argument, but it's convinced many people to believe in God. And actually it had a big impact on me in my undergraduate career at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. The new design argument, this is the fine-tuning argument from physics. And physicists have made discoveries about the fundamental parameters of the universe. The constants in the laws of physics, expansion rate of the Big Bang, and so on and so forth, so that we now know, it's a fact that we live in a fine-tuned universe. It's fine-tuned for life to exist, for solar systems to exist, for evolution to happen on this planet. And this has been a popular argument that's convinced a lot of atheists in the last 20-some years to believe in God. And in fact, Antony Flew was a popular atheist. He was famous for his article arguing against the design argument in the mid-20th century, and he actually came to believe in God because of this argument. We'll mention the moral argument. C.S. Lewis gives a version in Mere Christianity. William Sorley is another proponent of that. We'll look at the noological argument, which is an argument for mind, given by Richard Swinburne and J.P. Moreland and others. Basically argues that we have non-physical minds ourselves, or souls, and we know enough about evolution such that souls cannot be produced by matter rearranging. Therefore, the best explanation is God either inserted souls in some point in evolutionary history or rigged the universe so that when brains reached a certain degree of complexity, souls emerged. Then we'll look at the two major arguments against God's existence in history, namely naturalism, that science will explain everything, so there's no need for the God hypothesis to explain the existence of the universe, why the matter in the universe continues to stay in existence, why humans believe in God, and so on and so forth. This has been around since Plato's time, and we still see it today. The problem of evil, this is how can a good, loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God permit all this evil to this degree in the world? So it seems like either God is not personal, God doesn't care about us, or maybe God's not powerful enough to stop all the evil. That's the Mormon take on things, or so on. Then we'll talk about the immortality of the soul and self, and whether or not there's life after death. So Plato's teacher Socrates gave some arguments, and Plato has these in his book, the Phaedo. But there's a lot of arguments. Aristotle said it's arguable that the intellect persists after death, that part of the soul, the self. And so we want to know what kind of things human beings are. Do they have a non-physical component, a mind, intellect, or soul that could potentially survive bodily death? And we're going to look at near-death experiences. I love looking at near-death experiences because I don't know if you guys have seen Heaven is for Real, but it's a good chance to exercise our epistemological skills. When should we trust testimony? What testimony seems to be more reliable than the other? And what do we do with all this testimony? So, we'll look at that. Religious experience. A lot of people think that actually how they are convinced God exists is by an awareness of God, or experience of God, or an awareness of God answering prayers and so forth and so on. So actually this is very important. Religious epistemology, religious experience. What do we do with religious experiences? We'll look at William James and some other people, what they say. Faith and reason. We'll look at Thomas Aquinas and other people. How do we reconcile faith and reason, God and science, and so on? We'll look at miracles, because the question of Jesus is one of the most important questions for all humans on this planet. If Jesus was who he said he was, then we actually can know God through this person of Jesus. He is the manifestation of God on the earth and came down and spoke with us, interacted with humans. And so we can know God through this person of Jesus. So we want to know if he really was raised from the dead, which would seem to validate that he was who he said he was, God. We'll read David Hume's section 10 of the Inquiry and look at responses to Hume from William Lane Craig and Richard Swinburne. Also, we'll look at the problem of pluralism and particularism. This is a problem that affected me early on when I was an undergraduate. Aren't all religions true? How can one religion be true and all these others false? How can billions of people believe something false? And there's a problem with Christians. Every worldview is exclusivistic, really. But the important question for Christians is, well, how can a good and loving God send people to hell who've never heard of the name of Jesus? So we'll look at that. We'll read Ravi Zacharias, look at John Hick, and some other things on that issue. All right. Why bother with the philosophy of religion and other religions? Hey, we are all humans interacting on this planet with each other. We want to understand each other's worldviews. I mean, with Islam now, after the Paris bombings, or shootings, terrorist attacked a couple of days ago, we want to know, we need to learn what Islam says and doesn't say. We want to learn, just to even navigate our foreign policy, we have to learn about Islam. So, to communicate with our Buddhist neighbor next door, we need to learn a little about Buddhism, And for me, I have friends in all religions, and what's been great for me is to learn, yes, what do I believe myself? Where can I hold hands with people in different religions or worldviews and communicate? So, I think there's a level where we, just like in politics, I mean, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, whatever, Green Party, people can hold hands on many places, and so we should, as human beings, want to learn enough about everybody's worldview to know places where we can hold hands, have conversations, and so on. All right. Also, we're on a quest for truth. We might not have it yet if we were raised in a false worldview, but the project of philosophy is to find out what's false and what is true. All right. Roderick Chisholm, he wrote Theory of Knowledge. He gives us a very useful epistemic scale. Richard Dawkins is not a great philosopher, but he gives us a nice scale that even might be easier to understand than Chisholm's. But epistemology is the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge. What is knowledge? What serves as justification? Theories of truth, things like that. Chisholm. He says this. So, if we're taking some claim, let's say the championship game tonight, Oregon versus Ohio State, how sure are you in your belief that Ohio State, the Buckeyes, are going to win tonight? And what you do is start throwing evidence on the table. You give, this Oregon number one receiver, he was smoking the reefer, and so he's not going to be able to play tonight. That's going to give an edge at Ohio State, and so forth and so forth. All right. Things like future events are going to be we'll never have certainty, I don't think, other than I'm going to die someday. I can say, yes, I know for sure that someday I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to die. But besides that, I don't know what we can guarantee. All right. Richard Dawkins' epistemic scale from the God Delusion. We'll talk about this in the discussion board. So yeah, you can use either this one or this one if you want to describe where you are. All right, so pause it, read this, see what you think. Where are you? Here's an exercise that we would do in class. You can do it yourself and then post to the discussion board. Tell us what you think. Now, we are going to examine a lot of evidence for and against God's existence this semester. So, you should move somewhere on this scale. If you don't, I don't know what to say. All right. You probably will move. All right. Personal questions. This is another question discussion board. What are you most interested in? Out of everything I mentioned, miracles, life after death, evolution, God and science, faith and reason, religious experience, problem of pluralism. What question interests you most and why? All right. Sigmund Freud. You can pause this and read this slide. But basically, he wants to say, listen, you worship your father as a kid. He can do everything. I'd go with you anywhere, Daddy, and such and so forth. But you grow up a little bit and you're like, whoa. My dad he's finite. He's going to die someday. There's always somebody stronger than my dad, and so forth. And in order to cope with this problem, we project a big daddy in the sky to believe in God. Okay? Children make up their all-powerful, providential, morally authoritative object of worship. Marx said this: religion is a self-conscious and self-feeling of the man who either has not yet found himself or else, having found himself, has lost himself once more. But man is not an abstract being. Man is the world of men, the state, the society. This state, this society, produces religion, produces a perverted world consciousness because they are a perverted world. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the feelings of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of unspiritual conditions. It is the opium of the people. The people cannot be really happy until it has been deprived of illusory happiness by the abolition of religion. The demand that people should shake itself free of illusion as to its own condition is the demand that it should abandon a condition which needs illusion. Okay? So, listen, we have these economic forces in society. It oppresses people. And guess, the only hope, the only way to cope with living in oppression is to invent religion, to invent God, and tell ourselves these stories. And so we worship and we are happy because we invent this God. Okay? But if you get rid of the oppression, then we'll have no more need of God. We need to ask, are these guys right? Problem is this. These psychological arguments can work both ways, as the late philosopher Louis Pojman mentions, since a fear of daddy could also produce atheism in a person for the opposite reasons. Okay? So, yeah, if you hate your dad, you're not going to want God to exist. And actually, sociologically, they've done studies, and many atheists say that when they examine themselves that actually they are atheists because they had a poor father figure. But that's not all atheists. There's many rational atheists, some of my friends, who don't have that psychological explanation. Pojman, what if God exists? He says this: at the heart of the great theistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, is the idea that the universe was created by an all-powerful, benevolent, and providential God. Questions connected with the existence of God may be the most important that we could ask and try to answer. If God exists, then it is of the utmost importance that we come to know that fact. And it is also important to learn as much as we can about God and God's plan. Implications follow from God's existence that affect our understanding of the world and ourselves. If God exists, the world is not accidental, a product of mere chance and physical necessity, but a home that has been designed for rational and sentient beings, a place of personal purposefulness. We are not alone in our struggle for justice, but are working together with one whose plan is to redeem the world from evil. Most importantly, if God exists, then there is someone to whom we are ultimately responsible and to whom we owe our absolute devotion and worship. Other implications follow for our self-understanding, the way we ought to live our lives, and our prospects for continued life after death. So, once you learn naturalism and scientific atheism, reading Nietzsche, it's very bleak. It might be true, but it's bleak. On theism, God promises to always be with us. Well, on certain brands of theism, there is hope, there's meaning and purpose, and so on. What if there is no God? Pojman says this, quote, if there is no God, this too will affect our lives. We will have to look elsewhere for meaning and purpose. We will be forced to reconsider the grounds of what we take to be our moral obligations. We will enjoy or come to despair in the thought that we are entirely free from the obligation to live in devotion and submission to a cosmic authority figure. Whether there is a God or not will thus make a significant difference in the way we view the universe and in the way we live. All right, in class I would do a 1-minute paper on this, but Louis Pojman. And so it seems only rational to do everything we can to find out the truth of the matter. Now, a lot of people in the world don't care. They're too busy. They're trying to put food on the table. Blah, blah, blah. Does God exist or not? That's not going to affect me making my money today to feed my kids, to deal with these problems, and so on. But Pojman is saying it does matter. It changes everything. And we can get trapped in the day-to-day grind and insanity of the real-world life, never to think about these issues. But if God does exist, it does change everything. What Jesus said about worry, consider the lilies of the field. In Matthew, Sermon on the Mount, what Jesus says about what we should worry about, it does change everything. If Jesus is that peace we can seek. So we want to know. And we're going to start this exploration of this course. This will just be a snapshot. You'll have to do further study after this course. But we're going to start looking at these issues. All right, so please do your best to dedicate your hearts and minds to this quest this semester. All right, what else could hang on this issue? No free will. Humans are determined by nature to do and believe as they do. So on scientific atheism, humans are just meat machines, complex meat machines that have evolved by matter rearranging over millions of years. There is no non-physical self or soul with powers of free will. Okay? And students have a big time trying to deal with this. So think about that. Also, no objective morality. If there is no God, morality is very odd in an atheistic universe. Where good and evil would come from and how human beings would have that power to discover these non-physical things, it's a big problem for naturalists to explain. Science isn't about discovering truth. It's difficult to save the project of science and objective knowledge overall. There is no real or objective meaning or purpose in life, as Jean-Paul Sartre and Nietzsche will explain this when we explore this topic. And humans are not inherently valuable, as most people, as I believe. I think my niece is inherently valuable. She's not just a meat machine that evolved with no purpose. But yes, humans are ultimately just parts of nature, like dogs and rocks. And if they do have value, it's instrumental value, invented value, just like we invent value for money. Now, there might be responses to these from naturalists, but so forgive me for throwing out. Anyway, what else can hang on this issue? So with regards to Christian theism, with each theistic religion, there's going to be unique elements that are benefits. So at least with Christian theism, Christians claim Jesus was the person that revealed who God is and what God is like, which it was a perfect blend of grace and truth. He was rough on the Pharisees, the religious leaders who were legalistic and gave all these rules to people to follow, religion. And he was gracious. He was gracious to the woman caught in adultery in the street, who the Jews were going to stone, but he saved her. Jesus offered peace to weary souls who worry about things in life. He claimed to be the bread of life and the living water to quench our existential thirst for meaning, love, and acceptance. Jesus offered a chance to play a role, for each of us to play a role in the cosmic drama, to bring the texture of heaven, of love and beauty, to everything we touch in our lives, our family, friends, co-workers, and fellow students. And we can rely on God's power and not our own gifts and talents if this is true. Also, Jesus offered us salvation from our own ruined characters and a chance at growth into becoming loving and holy people. On Christianity, we are all a mess. All of us are dysfunctional. All of us are not living life as we should. And if Jesus is right, he offers a radical plan of growth into becoming loving and holy people. And Jesus promised to always be with us when we need love and comfort and a friend. And salvation from death. The gift of salvation must be accepted. It's not earned through works or karma, which distinguishes Christianity from most other religions. All right. The wrong question, I would argue, is this. Is there proof that God exists? All right, we don't have proof for most of the things we know. So we need to, when someone uses the word proof, what do you mean by proof? And go back to Chisholm's scale. Like, a lot of people think we can have knowledge without it being certain, +6 on the Chisholm scale. But maybe just beyond reasonable doubt is sufficient for knowledge. All right. Better question is this. Given what we see in the world, is it more reasonable to believe that God explains these things or not? Let's take a look at what J.P. Moreland says in his book, The God Question. And I do love this book. If you're a skeptic, the first chapter alone is worth the price. Quote, a better way to approach the question of the existence of God is similar to a technique that is successfully practiced in science, history, law, philosophy, and other areas. I'll call it a cumulative case inference to the best explanation. This intellectual strategy has two characteristics. First, as the name suggests, it involves an inference to the best explanation. This occurs when we identify a range of data to be explained, formulate a pool of possible explanations, and judge that one is the best among the pool. When this happens, the data provide evidence that the explanation is true. For example, if we observe lightning, static electricity, and so forth, and if we postulate that there are such things as electrons with certain characteristics, a certain charge and mass, we are entitled to believe in electrons if they provide the best explanation of the data. Similarly, if a range of data surfaces in a jury trial and the best explanation is that the defendant committed the crime in a certain way, then we are entitled to believe that this is so. So in this class, we will look at some of the evidence from design of the universe, the existence of the universe, the existence of minds, souls, humans, and see if the theistic hypothesis is a better explanation than the atheistic or naturalistic hypothesis. This is very different than assuming that no God exists as the default intellectual position and expecting to be talked into God's existence. All right? So you're innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, but why should it be the case when we're trying to explore whether or not God exists? Why don't we just say, hey, we've got two possible explanations, no God or God. Let's look at the data. Which of these hypotheses best explains the data? All right? So, we can, if you want, bring this up on the discussion board. We'll talk about it. What is the philosophy of religion? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, both good. You can look up these things. We want to talk about some epistemological issues, faith and reason. Most people have a false definition of faith, I would argue. So when you look at a New Testament definition of faith, it is a trust in. It is not a blind faith, a leap in the dark. Okay? So it's like faith in a person. So before you trust yourselves with a wedding vow, you have good evidence that the spouse will be a good spouse. Okay? And then you make that commitment. You trust that thing. Or you see that boat. Let's say you built that boat. You know that boat is safe. So you trust that boat. It's one thing to believe the boat's safe. It's another thing to jump in the boat. So jumping in the boat is taking a step of faith. Mere belief is not faith. And faith is not a blind faith, at least in the New Testament sense. So be careful when you post this semester. Define your view of faith. Most students mean blind faith and not a reasonable faith. So make sure you specify. Also, we'll look at Aquinas, what he means by knowing something on faith versus natural reason. What he means by knowing something on faith is something that's revealed through the revealed documents. But he's not going to say that it's a blind faith while we accept the New Testament. He's just going to say the stuff that God revealed through the person of Jesus and the prophets is known by faith. But it's not a blind faith. I'm sorry, that was kind of confusing, but we'll go over it. Is there a God or gods? Are there many gods like the Greeks thought, or as Mormons think? Or is there just one God as Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Sikhs believe? And some Hindus. We'll look at arguments for God's existence, against, miracles, life after death, and so on. All right, Peter Kreeft, he's one of my favorite philosophers of religion. I read 10 of his books. Look at these books, I love them, all of them. Socrates Meets Jesus, Between Heaven and Hell, that was the first one I read back in '96 in Yellowstone National Park. Summer I was cleaning toilets there as a housekeeper. Love is Stronger Than Death, Making Sense of Suffering. Love is Stronger Than Death is the best book on the philosophy of death I've read. I've spoken at a couple of funerals, and I've used stuff from that book. making sense out of suffering is fantastic. So he lost a child, and he's just trying to carve out enough room to function. So one of the problems of evil is the emotional problem of evil, where you have a great evil happen in your life, you lose a loved one, and it's not going to help if someone gives you a philosophical reason why morally why God gave you allow this evil to happen in your life. You know, oftentimes we just need a friend to not to fix us, but just to feel our pain, to be empathy, to sit with us. All right? We don't want to be fixed or given a philosophical explanation. We just want human company and companionship. All right. I'm not going to read this, but pause it and read this if you want. Pause it and read this if you want. I'm not going to read this, just pause it and read it. Do you agree or disagree? Bring this up on the discussion board, what Kreeft and Kenny say. So think about these questions. Pause it. Bring up one of these discussions on the questions on the discussion board if you want. Dawkins. Would the world have been poor without the concept of God? Without God, we don't get the awesome movie Ben-Hur. We don't get the Charlie Brown Christmas special. All right, and so forth and so on. We don't get the great cathedrals in Europe. We don't get the religious music. No Sistine Chapel, no Ben-Hur, no U.S. Constitution, if God doesn't exist. Yeah, the United States Declaration of Independence and our Constitution would look very, very, very different if there is no God. All right. Family Guy. You can look at that. All right, this is a great distinction here. Rational versus psychological objectivity. This is in the document too if you want to look at this. So being psychologically objective is if you don't care. Okay? Rationally objective is whether or not you're competent intellectually to evaluate the evidence. So I actually watched a show on Investigation Discovery today. This woman had a son who was accused of breaking and entering, and he was shot and killed by the neighbor man. And she said, I did not want my son to be a criminal, to break in, and she actually said, but she's like, I'm going to wait and examine the evidence before I make this decision. Okay? So, sports might be another example too. Like, a lot of people don't care if Oregon wins tonight or Ohio State. But I'm in Ohio. There tends to be a lot of Bucks fans around here. And so a lot of people are not psychologically objective. They want Ohio State to win. Okay. Here's another example. Pause it and read this. So it's not always good to not be psychologically objective. So some people say worse than hatred is apathy. So if you really don't care if God exists or not, then that might be a real problem. We shouldn't be psychologically objective about whether or not God exists. But we should be rationally objective about whether or not God exists. We should be able to be philosophers of religion, examine the evidence for and against. Okay? Just like this slide says, we should not be rationally objective. We should not be psychologically objective about our spouse cheating on us. It'd be better if our spouse was not cheating. And we should hope that's not true. But hopefully we can be rational enough to examine the evidence and so on. All right. We'll come to this later, but this has to do with, we'll talk about Pascal's wager and truth-dependent arguments, pragmatic arguments for God's existence, and truth-independent pragmatic arguments for God's existence. All right. Concepts of God. This is on your quiz. Monotheism, belief in one God. Classical theism, view that there's one omnipotent, all-powerful, omnipresent, all-present, omniscient, all-knowing, self-existence, possessing the property of aseity. This being exists. This being created the universe and sustains it or conserves it in existence. All right? Finite theism believes in a smaller God. So God does not have the infinite omni-properties. So the church, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, the Latter-day Saint Church in Salt Lake City, Utah, LDS theology, they're finite theists. So there's many gods, actually. God's small, and there's many polytheism. Types of polytheism. Henotheism is most interesting here. So there's many gods in the universe, but we just worship that God of our town, or the God we need that day. So in Mormonism, we worship our Heavenly Father, the God who's in charge of our planet. We don't worry about worshiping any of the other gods that are in the universe on Mormonism. Okay? And in Hinduism, there's many gods, 2 million. So you can't worship all of them. Just worship the God of your town, and or the particular God that you need that day, and his or her specialty. Pantheism, panentheism. Pause it and read this. All right. Agnosticism. That's a claim that there is not enough evidence for us to know whether God does or does not exist. That's religious skepticism. There's a couple types of agnostics. Some say, like Hume, we can't even ask the question. So even analyzing the evidence doesn't make any sense. Evidentialism, natural theology. Here's some Bible references for natural theology. Basically, we have on theism, general revelation. If God exists, God has revealed some things about his or her character through the natural world. And, yeah. Fideism says that religious belief must be based on faith alone, a blind faith against the evidence. All right. A priori, a posteriori. Pause it, read these. All right. Read this. Pause it. Talk about this on the discussion board if you want. Again, here's Chisholm's thing. And, yeah, we don't need certainty for knowledge. Most people don't believe that. Okay? You might, so I don't want to determine your epistemology for you. But there's a lot of things that we cannot prove that we know also. So how you know things might be different than how you might prove it to someone else. So, yeah. I have knowledge, and you're going to have to trust me on my testimony, which might be difficult in some circumstances. So start thinking about these cases, okay, that cannot be proved, all right? And so what we're going to do this semester, we're going to throw it all on the table, work through it with our hearts and minds, and if it's counterbalanced, we might use Blaise Pascal's wager to solve this problem. Okay. Presumption of atheism, we mentioned this with the J.P. Moreland thing. Okay. But I'll skip this right now. This is long enough. Pause it and read these quotes if you want. we need to ask this question. Are we free to seek the truth? Herbert Spencer said this over 100 years ago. Quote, "There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all arguments, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation." Contempt prior to investigation. If you hate something, or if you have contempt for something, you're not going to study the best arguments for that view. So we need to do it's difficult to do philosophy. We need to do a self-analysis here. So if there's a view in politics or in relationships that you hate or have contempt for, or if something turns out to be true, would you hate that your mother or best friend was right about it? So if you hate, then we need to think about that and clear our minds so we're free to actually study these issues. We're not going to give a fair shake to an argument if we hate it, if we hate that position. So if you hate the thought that God exists, you will not give the arguments in favor of God's existence a fair shot. So think about it. All right. And there's so much misunderstanding in our culture about religion, and many in the media and in the academy are simply illiterate and blinded by political correctness that they think a belief in God is simply a blind, illogical leap of faith for which there is no evidence. So on this view, sincerity of belief is all that matters. And most of us actually believe this without thinking about it. And this view is hammered into us daily. I hear it on the news all the time. But forget that. We are philosophers examining the evidence. Another problem, we tend to create God in our own image. Freud said we tend to project things onto God, some of our unhealthy views of our fathers. The psalmist, David or someone else, said, "You thought I was just like you." But to create God in our image or to make God a God in your mind that works for you is not what a philosopher does. We must seek to find out if it's probable that God exists and to find out what God is really like. This might be very uncomfortable for us. Sometimes the truth is ugly or hurts us, is not comfortable. Okay? So think about this. Post on the discussion board if you want. How free are you to explore this question of God's existence? Ask yourself if you're ready to try and explore this God question. Does God exist? If so, what is God really like? Are you free to do this, or will you simply ignore the evidence for or against and create a God that satisfies your needs? Reality is the way it is. If God exists, then God has a certain nature and attributes. We need to ask what is true and what is false about this God. Sincerity of belief does not matter. It doesn't matter if you, with all your heart, believe that glass on the table is filled with water and not hydrochloric acid. If there's hydrochloric acid in that vial, it's going to kill you. No matter how much we want to believe God is like X, Y, or Z, it doesn't matter. You know? All right. Freeze it here and read this. This is a good thing if you want to pause this and read that on the discussion board, or quote this and discuss it. All right. All right, I'll see you guys on the discussion board. The championship game is approaching. Goodbye from Cincinnati, Ohio.